Namaskar and welcome to Indian Diplomacy, show on Doordarshan, India's national television channel about Indian foreign policy, India's international relations, and important regional and global developments that have an impact on India's rise. Viewers, in this episode, we are looking at a seminal flashpoint in Asia around Taiwan. This self-governed democratic island has survived for 75 years in the shadow of the dragon, mainland China. The question is, will it be able to survive? Will it be able to maintain its existence and its prosperity and its technological prowess in the face of relentless military and other forms of browbeating and intimidation by China? This is what we are going to be looking at. What is the role of other players in this conflict around the status of Taiwan, and what are India's stakes, and so on. And to discuss this, let me introduce you to a very distinguished guest who's joined me today in the studio, Vice Admiral Pradeep Chauhan.
Thank you.
Vice Admiral Chauhan is Director General of a very important think tank of India, the National Maritime Foundation. He has done 4 decades of distinguished service in the Indian Navy. He was commander of the Western Naval Command of India. Vice Admiral Chauhan, welcome to Indian Diplomacy.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure and a privilege.
Vice Admiral, whenever we talk about Taiwan, there is this perpetual sense of a crisis, and that war clouds are looming, or there is this the Chinese want to quote unquote reunify it into the mainland, and this is the so-called unfinished task since the foundation of the People's Republic. And in the Xi Jinping era, last 12 years, since 2012, they have become more menacing and more aggressive in staking claims over Taiwan, and have been trying to push the boundaries, push the envelopes ever so closer to the point where they want to absorb it somehow or the other. So in that kind of a scenario, every month or so now, earlier we used to have Taiwan Straits crisis in decades, like in 1950s, 1990s, and now it looks like this is a permanent situation of crisis. So it looks like a classic David versus Goliath kind of situation, where there's this small little island that's trying to survive. And so in that context, if you could start by talking about this crisis and the Chinese expansionism, and why is it that now they are pushing so hard against Taiwan, and how much can Taiwan resist?
Well, actually, thank you very much. China is indeed a dragon. It is now become, under the Xi Jinping era, it has certainly become the most coercive power. It started off by being assertive. It belied all Western beliefs that perhaps, or hopes that it would have a peaceful rise. Its rise has been remarkable, but anything but peaceful. Now, one of the bones that are stuck in the Chinese gullet, shall we say, is in fact Taiwan. And since Taiwan represents so many things that are antithetical to the Chinese Communist Party, for them it is a crucial element of their legitimacy that they wish to continue to establish. Now, Taiwan has, of course, over the years, over the decades that it has been a democratic and free country, has had a demographic shift of its own. And while at a certain point in time, maybe 2 decades ago, a very large number of Taiwan nationals still hearkened back to what they called motherland or homeland or mainland China. And for a long period of time, this was considered to be the vulnerable Achilles heel of Taiwan vis-a-vis China. So China developed a great amount of what I would like to call narrative changing mechanisms, narrative warfare. In trying to enter into the Taiwanese mind and say that, we are the mother country, you are an, slightly wayward child, and if you come back, we all will be forgiven, and you'll be the prodigal son returning. However, because China did not have the military muscle with which to back up this particular set of approaches, Taiwan continued to resist quite robustly, and then in fact Taiwan became more and more democratic. That was a second bone stuck in the Chinese gullet, because it indicated to the world and to the Taiwanese people themselves, that there is more than just a one-party rule kind of system.
Yeah, culturally we are also Chinese, but we have a democratic.
But we have a democratic system, and therefore you too, in other words, you too, that you could be anywhere in the world, including mainland China, could have such a thing. Now, with political freedoms, with economic progression and economic progress, without necessarily subverting your hopes, your individual hopes and desires to a party mechanism. So, I think that what has happened is that there's a demographic shift which has occurred, and now the young, I was in Taiwan not very long ago, and the young Taiwanese of the ages of, let's say, 37, 38 and below, just 40 and below, let's say, they don't believe that they're Chinese who have come to Taiwan. They say we are ethnically Chinese or Han Chinese in the bulk, but we are Taiwanese. What do we have to do with Taiwan? Now, this is genuinely upsetting to the leadership in China.
So, it's a kind of like an antithesis of the communist China in many ways. But Vice Admiral, so now let's get down to the military aspects now in more detail. So, the Chinese have been threatening either an outright invasion, and now they are saying that they could do a blockade and surround Taiwan on all sides, while on the other hand the US and its allied system, especially Japan, the Philippines, the ones that are closest to Taiwan, have been saying that they will try and prevent that from happening, or that they are committed to defending Taiwan. So, you have this lineup of the US and its alliance system on one side, and then the Chinese, and this is of course part of the so-called new Cold War and the great power rivalry also, and Taiwan becomes probably the hottest theater of this great power rivalry and machinations. So, could you talk a little bit about these military aspects, and whether, and people have been saying, the US Indo-Pacific commander was saying that Xi Jinping has ordered his military to be ready for an invasion by 2027, which is not far away. So, are they really preparing for something to do something so drastic, and if so, what are Taiwan's defenses with the US alliance system?
Okay, thank you. That's a great question. So, it is true that Xi Jinping has given instructions to his army and his military, Navy, Air Force, that you please become ready. Now, the timeline that he has laid down is 2027, which means that the window of opportunity for China will open at that point in time, according to Xi Jinping's calculations. That doesn't mean that in 2027 we'll see an invasion. It just means that that's the time when China feels that it might be ready. But the military preparation for conflict is obviously going to be a subset of China's overall management of the environment. It has to be able to do shaping. Now, because the risks in Taiwan are so high for everybody concerned, you've mentioned quite a number of the actors, but I would like to bring India in here as well.
Sure.
So, first, for Taiwan, a victory by China would be obviously catastrophic. For China, a defeat, a military defeat where they were not able to reunify Taiwan by force, would be equally catastrophic for the Xi Jinping coterie in particular, but for the Communist Party of China in general. For the United States, a victory by the PLA or by the mainland Chinese over Taiwan would be once again equally catastrophic, because it would destroy the entire security architecture as we see it. What about for India? For India, it would be equally, I would say equally, and I use the word with care, equally catastrophic, because it would then free up the entire Chinese ability. In other words, we would end up in being the next domino. And so, since the risks are quite so high, everybody will try and proceed with caution. And without the ability, I mean, everybody will make lots of Wild West kind of noises, but the Chinese are certainly not ready yet for a cross-strait. That means the cross-strait balance of military power is not yet so overwhelmingly in favor of China. Many Indian commentators unfortunately tend to look at how many platforms, they do bean counting, how many landing ship assaults do the Chinese have, how many hovercraft, etc., etc. But the Chinese and most militaries don't look at power, military power, in these terms, in platform-centric terms. They look at the military as an organic whole, an instrument, a system. So it is a system. The Chinese look at their military power as a system which will compete, contest another system. And this system comprises, of course, the platforms, of course, the weapon sensors, but also the entire network of the shooter, the sensor, the weapon, the platform, the network, the cyber capabilities, all of this. More important or equally important, remember that if you need to shape the environment, and every country, every military first shapes its probable battle space before even threatening to fire the first shot. So to shape, China will not, I'm quite certain about this, will not be in a position to launch any kind of military invasion if it feels that it has not yet adequately shaped the battlefield. Just that now gives huge opportunities for everybody else, such that our actions, the United States actions, Japan's actions, less so the Philippines, but certainly these three and Australia's actions, must be therefore geared towards convincing China that the time is not right and the time will never be right.
And that will be too costly.
The cost to your political system, and therefore it will pose not an existential cost to mainland China, but certainly an existential cost to the party. And since the strategic center of gravity of China is indeed the Communist Party of China, that China cannot afford yet. And therefore, as long as we are able to make sure that the Chinese perception remains one of marginal uncertainty, conflict is likely to be deterred. Does that mean that by 2027 China won't have the capacity? What about Taiwan? I mean, in all this, Taiwan is not sitting like one demure damsel waiting for either the dragon or the knight to rescue or to ravage her. Taiwan has adopted a system of total defense. And as you are aware, that means that Taiwan has decided to decentralize its defenses all across the country. In other words, the ability for mainland China or Xi Jinping's military to hit a strategic center of gravity in Taiwan doesn't exist.
Like a coup de grace which will end the whole...
in one go. But that's not there. So it decentralizes military command, it decentralizes military control. It creates a situation where not only is the island, the topography of Taiwan difficult, because no matter where you invade, if you have to go to the other part, you have to cross the central highlands of Taiwan. And there are not that many beaches which will allow the Chinese the ability to simply do amphibious landings. Last point, and so they will be forced to do vertical envelopment. Now, vertical envelopment has much smaller numbers involved. And last point I wanted to emphasize, which you had touched upon very astutely, was this business of blockade. So I wanted to emphasize that blockade is an act of war. And once you do a blockade, you have to announce a blockade, and a blockade cannot be done selectively. You have to blockade for all, whatever part of the coast of the enemy that you are blockading is closed to all, and I mean ALL, all.
For international commerce, everybody.
Everybody. No ship of any kind, including humanitarian assistance ships. There is one more part which we need to factor in, that if for China to be able to exercise a military option, there is a very large expatriate community sitting in Taiwan. Where will they go? How many countries will be able to lean back? I mean, India, we've got a very small, strong but small diaspora there. It's only 6,000 people. But if you take, say, Indonesia, they've got almost 280,000 people. The United States. So how many, even if there were no other military considerations, what would these countries do? How will you pick up 200,000 people? We have seen the difficulties we have. So ships, amphibious craft will get deployed. Once amphibious craft get deployed, somebody gets hit, the situation will spin rapidly out of control of the Chinese calculation of dealing with only the United States and only Taiwan.
So perhaps for the moment they will desist from anything drastic given all these calculations. But Vice Admiral, let me bring in the US now. Many people are skeptical about whether the US will really go to war to defend Taiwan. And I remember when they abandoned Afghanistan 2021, Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor in the Biden administration, was asked about it. Will you also one day abandon Taiwan? And then he said, no, that's a different question in a different context. It's not like, and there, the adversary is China. It's not a ragtag group like Taliban, right? So, and he said that we will do all it takes to ensure, the status quo remains and all that. So, since then, President Biden has also personally many times said that we are bound to defend Taiwan at all costs. So, but on the other hand, there are others who say that this is all cheap talk, and really, when push comes to shove, why would the United States risk a great power war or a nuclear war or something like that with a, with a peer competitor like China over a small territory like Taiwan, and so what are your thoughts on the credibility of the US commitment? Because this is a very central question ultimately, because from what I have read, Taiwan can maybe hold out only for 72 hours or 96 hours at most on its own, and it will need significant reinforcements from the US especially to be able to beat back any potential Chinese invasion. So, what do you think is the US forces, and you interact a lot with their Indo-Pacific commanders. So, what is the sense you are getting about the US preparedness and willingness to, to hold the line and defend Taiwan?
Okay, so there are 3 points here. One of them is that how credible, what do you think about the United States' willingness to fight? Now, this is a question which comes up from time to time in history and even in recent history, because, depending upon whether you started your history of the United States military capability with the Vietnam War, or you started it with the Second World War, or started it with the Korean War, you get different statistics. Now, don't forget that yes, this is a country in Vietnam that lost on account of the situation at home. Yes, it lost on account of the drugs. Yes, it lost on account of the what we call the Coca-Cola syndrome. No offense to Coca-Cola, but However, this is the same country that got millions of body bags home in Guadalcanal and in the retaking of the island chains of the South Pacific during the Second World War. So the capacity of a country ought to be looked at, a capacity to absorb loss ought to be looked at over a wider span of history than simply the one in which you or I or whoever it is might be existing. Imagine the United States refusing to come to the aid of Taiwan and allowing therefore a victory by the Chinese over Taiwan. It would be the end of the security architecture of the entire Indo-Pacific as we know it, not limited to the Pacific. Unfortunately, when Indians often talk about the Indo-Pacific, they tend to think that it lies east of us, and we immediately start, invoking the India's Act East policy, etc. But our Prime Minister has been quite unequivocal in defining the geographical bounds of our conceptualization of the Indo-Pacific. And this is important because when America if America was not to fight and was to be toppled, it would not change only the security structures and architecture of the Pacific, but everything right from Eastern Africa all the way across to the western coast of the United States. And the spillover would certainly impact everything from the Arctic to the Atlantic. So the
whole world order is at stake.
So the stakes are not America is not in this game to either defend or protect or abandon Taiwan. It is in this game to maintain the world security architecture as it currently stands. And this they cannot afford not to do. They cannot afford to have a situation where the security architecture of this entire globe will now be decided upon by Beijing. Now, I think that therefore, the framework within which we need to address this particular question of whether America will fight is this, that America cannot afford not to fight.
Yeah, it's a great power status and balance of power.
My point is that even if you don't consider that one great power is contesting a rising great power, I don't think, for example, personally, I don't think China is a great power yet. I think that China has the largest navy in the world, but that doesn't mean it's got a global navy. It's not able to get out of the first island chain. So though they've got numerical and qualitative capacities of significance, Numerically, you know the story as well as I
It's
do.
the largest shipbuilding enterprise in history and all.
But it's still, with all of that, it still can't. You know why? Let me give you a non-conflict example, perhaps that might throw some light on it. You often hear the Chinese lament, about the Malacca dilemma. And the Malacca dilemma is not only about the state of Malacca, but the passage of critical goods through any of the choke points, whether it's Malacca, Sunda, Lombok, or Hormuz, or Bab el-Mandeb, etc., or Bashi Channel, etc. Why don't you ever hear the Japanese talk about the Malacca dilemma? Why don't you ever hear Korea, the Republic of Korea, say we have a Malacca dilemma?
Even though they're also dependent on the same waterways.
Aren't they?
Yeah.
Why don't you hear this? The reason you don't hear this is because they have friends.
Yeah.
And China has no friends. And if you look at the position of China, it's as it has got about the worst geography, maritime geography on the planet. And it is surrounded by countries that are inimical to it. Why are they inimical to China? And therefore, China's ability to utilize its military power in a manner befitting a great power. Of course, it is fashionable to say that China is a great power. I personally tend to be a skeptic about this, because you have not defined what a great power is, except in bean count numbers of how many ships are with whom, or how many tanks.
But of course, it has a gigantic economy and has huge influence in other parts of the world which are non-military. But Vice Admiral, coming to India now, I was reading a very interesting essay by Arzan Tarapur, who is this non-resident fellow at the Australian Security Policy Institute. And he was saying that India is a non-belligerent state when it comes to Taiwan, but it's could become a leader for all the non-belligerent states who have a stake in this conflict. So while it's unlikely that our Navy will actually go and participate in combat operations to defend Taiwan, there are other things India could do, and he has suggested including the Malacca, to be able to blockade it, or to enable the US Navy to have more pathways and easier to bring in reinforcements into the region quicker. So there is certainly something that India could do both militarily and non-militarily, and he has outlined some of these ideas. But and I believe our armed forces have also commissioned internal reviews and assessments of what we will do in terms of a scenario if the Chinese invade Taiwan. And of course, we are building robust relations with Taiwan, especially in the economic realm. Foxconn, some of the big semiconductor companies are investing in India, and we continue to have robust trade and other informal relations with Taiwan. So in that context, what do you think should be our position vis-a-vis this building crisis, and can we indeed contribute to deterring the worst case scenario, which is a Chinese invasion of Taiwan?
Yes, in a short answer, yes. I tend to agree with much of what Mr. Tarapur has written. And Arzan's paper is an interesting paper in many respects, because it cuts very close to home. We all quote Sun Tzu's comment that the acme of military leadership is the ability to defeat the enemy without actually going to conflict. And all of these mechanisms are, if we believe that, because we teach that, then we are in a position to actually affect China's ability to conduct a military misadventure, adventure, whichever way you want to call it, by simply providing the following things. One, we are the most competent and the most powerful, both, Navy in the Indian Ocean. As we take up the responsibilities that come with major power status, it frees up the United States, as Arzan has already mentioned.
To focus on the Pacific, yeah.
They can then go to the Pacific. Second, it is a mistake to think that the Indian carrier groups, for example, they are carrier battle groups, they are not carrier strike groups. But when you have carrier strike groups and you want to project military power ashore, you also need to defend your own, you have to have sea control in those limited areas. That is where the Indian Navy is being looked at with greater and greater respect. That is why the Malabar series of naval exercises, where all the four countries constituting the Quad, although not the Quad in itself, are in fact engaged in providing interoperability to the level in which this can be done. Third, as we start to patrol more aggressively, it is a mistake to think that when I said this domino effect and you will be next, it doesn't mean that this, I'm talking about the trans-Himalayan border alone. I'm talking about the concept of maneuver in India, which is well understood by Indians, where we do not want to end up in a conflict of attrition in a place where our strength is pitted against his strength. But we want to be able to swing across to places where we have the high advantage. And therefore, you will see that the concerns that we have should Taiwan fall is not limited to the trans-Himalayan border alone, but encompasses the whole Indian Ocean, because that's what is driving the Chinese economic growth model. Their ability to do an economic miracle that will allow themselves to have an internally driven economy is absolutely zero. China has no option but to come and maintain its economy as a function of external trade. Here, it is 90% of all Chinese merchandise trade is flowing over the oceans. 50% of that flows into the Indian Ocean, either for destinations within Indian Ocean or to destinations through which the Indian Ocean is a necessary point of transit. Consequently, can the Indians tie this down? Yes, indeed.
Well, viewers, this has been a fascinating conversation with Vice Admiral Pradeep Chauhan, and I think the sum of what we have just discussed is that this is a perpetual problem area, this Taiwan Straits, and we are going to see more crises, especially because the Chinese, because of their ultra-nationalism and the kind of totalitarian rule that we are seeing under President Xi Jinping and his ambitions for hegemony. But at the same time, Taiwan is not defenseless, and Taiwan has got allies. Taiwan has got its own capacities to resist to the extent it can. And then there are many like-minded countries that do not want Taiwan to fall. Taiwan is the headquarters for the world's chip manufacturing, semiconductors. So the stakes are very high. And I think the global economy, not to mention the balance of power and other things which Admiral Chauhan was talking about, even the global economy could face a catastrophic failure if China is allowed to overrun Taiwan. So and India is very much a stakeholder. It's becoming more proactive. It's involved in a lot of coalitions and friendships in the Indo-Pacific, and it will of course test India's mettle. But India is very much aware of the potential for a conflict there, and is preparing in its own way and looking at what options it has to bring to the table to deter the worst case scenario. Let me thank Vice Admiral Chauhan. Thank you, sir. Always intellectual discussion and thought provoking with you.
Thank you so much. I would like to extend the compliments back to you. Thank you so
Viewers, let's keep an eye on the Taiwan issue. It's perpetually on the boil, and Xi Jinping has extended his rule indefinitely, and it is probably going to be the crowning glory of his career to quote unquote reunify Taiwan by force or other means, and they will not give up on this, what they call the core of their core interests. But then there are core interests for many other countries to maintain Taiwan as it is, as a free country, as a democracy, and as a technological powerhouse. So it's a contest, and we don't know how it will ultimately pan out, but we need to follow this very carefully, because the world order, nothing less than the world order, is at stake. Thank you for watching. I'll see you again next time. Take care.